everyone. Welcome to 1.5 Degrees, the podcast where together we explore the science, solutions, and stories involved in the fight against climate change. I'm your host, Heidi Pan, speaking with the professionals behind the latest research, policies, culture, and innovations shaping our response to global environmental challenges. For today's episode, we are joined by Laurie Schoeman, who has extensive experience at the intersection of housing and climate risk reduction, recently serving as the Senior Advisor on Climate Resilience and on Housing Policy at the White House Domestic Policy Council, advising efforts to build housing supply, enable federal investment in housing, and reduce barriers to housing development to discuss climate risk reduction and affordable housing, leadership in advancing equity and sustainability initiatives, and innovative strategies driving climate resilient communities. Thank you so much for joining us today, Laurie. It's truly an honor.
Thank you, Heidi. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I guess to begin, can you give a bit of background as to what it is that you do and I guess how you kind of got to where you are today?
So my work in this space is informed by the work I've done on the front lines in communities, serving a variety of communities that have deep needs. I started out my career after college working for the Catholic Church for the Archdiocese of New York, where we ran over 150 emergency shelters and feeding programs with churches across the tri-state area. And it was amazing to me to see how not having a home and how lacking that stable resource impacts a person's mind, their physical self, their soul, right? And I really got a deep sense of how to be in service to communities. Done that work for quite a bit. So I spent about 5 years at the Archdiocese serving the most vulnerable communities in the New York City. And then I went back to school to learn how to work on policies that would actually solve the challenges that so many of the communities I served were facing. And through the experience of going to get an advanced degree and then moving into the policy space, I never forgot the importance of being in service on the ground. And so a lot of my professional background is informed by my service. I think that all policymakers and everyone who works in programs and policy solutions should have that background, because when we make policy, it should be able to incorporate the experiences of actually implementing work. So I saw in California what it means to have a lapse in Section 8 vouchers in DC and what that looks like on the ground. Landlords are told that they're not going to get paid by the federal government, which is what happened when I was at the city of Alameda in the early aughts, and what that does to residents, families, individuals that, now are told by their landlord, we need to figure out a way to pay for your unit. So I always think about when doing policy, what will that impact folks on the ground all over the country? And I've had some really important experiences being able to take on really kind of risky bets with very high-risk projects and see them through. And the way I've been able to see them through is through my commitment to serve.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for taking me through that. And I'd love to go into kind of some of those projects that you talked about briefly here. I guess this is kind of talking into specifics about what you do. What does a day of work look like for you? And do you have a favorite or at least favorite aspect of part of your work?
So I think at the most recent experience at the White House was all-consuming. When you're working for an administration you deeply believe in, that supports policies that you think are just so critical to the livelihood and health of our nation, it's hard to sleep. You're sort of always thinking about what can you do better? What did you not do? What needs to happen to make some things move? I always think about the communities I've served. They're on the front of my mind every day. To think about the ability and the honor to be able to serve the president's initiatives on climate and then housing was a really thrilling experience. And, I think that it's not naive to say you really truly feel like you're at the top of the world and you've got to deliver for the people. And I think that my day is essentially, I'm a mother of an 8-year-old. I'm a single mother. So I make sure that he's taken care of. But at the same time, I'm balancing phone calls. I'm dealing with last minute issues. I'm dealing with challenges while mothering. And he is someone who has now become very familiar with his mom being on the phone simultaneously while cooking him dinner and telling him to get dressed for bed. And sometimes in that order, unfortunately. It's very exciting to be able to be at the highest levels of the government to create and support policy, but it's daunting because there's just so much need. And, once you think that you've accomplished one thing, you realize there's a whole avalanche of other issues. Just to give you an example, I've been working on climate policy and housing policy at the White House for 2 years. And every time there's an event, some kind of hurricane or an earthquake or fire, your whole program is shuffled. And that's sort of the space we're in the housing space. We think we make 2 steps forward, and then all of a sudden there's a flood that comes in or a fire that resets everything, and you lose housing units, you disrupt communities. So it's a very hard time right now. And so my day to day is really just trying to stay on top of everything. And then the other issue is, there's a lot of new communications that have emerged over the last couple of years, many more podcasts, many more news channels. So keeping track of that is really interesting.
It's an interesting thing that you mentioned. I haven't really thought about that, and especially it's been such rapid change in the last few years related to that. And it's really important to have that line of communication up to date while everything's changing all the time. To go back on this, I also am a child of a single mother. It's definitely a lot. So I guess, can you share kind of a moment or experience that maybe inspired you to focus on climate risk reduction and sustainability? And then I guess in the context of affordable housing, is this related to, your volunteer work?
I'm glad that you asked that, Heidi. So going back to my initial days, I was actually paid to do that work. So that was really powerful to actually have a salary, not a big salary, but enough to survive. So I mentioned to you that I'd worked in the emergency feeding and shelter community for many years. And the way that not having a house and a home shaped an individual's perspective on life. As it happens, I'm also kind of a weather buff, a science geek, and I love weather patterns. I love extreme weather. Since I was 4 years old, I've been following weather patterns, and I used to pride myself on predicting tornadoes. And so over the years working in California, I worked on some really interesting projects related to housing, and then I expanded out to institutional work and building buildings that did a range of things, from educating folks to providing service to communities. I became sort of socialized in California by the threat of extreme weather, whether it's fires or earthquakes. But it was not until I came to back to New York, and experienced Superstorm Sandy, which, probably was the most momentous climate event since Katrina in terms of its scale and its scope. And I had done some work after Katrina and gotten involved with housing solutions, but it wasn't until I came into working in Sandy that I realized, our housing that we built, and many housing that we built for vulnerable communities, low-income communities, are at the front lines of climate risk. And so I remember thinking about what it means to lose a home and what that does to a person. And then in comes a weather event like a storm, and you put the two together and you have a recipe for real tragedy. And through my planning work, I knew that a lot of the communities that were in the areas that were most impacted by Sandy, the Rockaways, right? Southern Brooklyn, these are communities that are lowest income. We had a lot of public housing residents that had been moved there because that was part of a slum clearance program in New York. So they were moved from the highlands of Manhattan to the lowlands of the Rockaways. And I saw that throughout New Jersey and New York, how much this storm impacted communities. We lost thousands of units. Many units were damaged. And I really got my start on the climate and housing intersection at that very moment. I was hired by an organization called Enterprise Community Partners to run the Sandy Recovery Program. And through that work, I was honored to serve over 12 different affordable housing developers, which with about 15,000 units of housing. And they had never experienced a storm like this. So I remember sitting in rooms with these leaders and saying, like, did you know? Did you have a plan? Did you prepare? What happened? What did you do? How did you deal with this? And, it was a catastrophic incident for many folks. Well, little did we know that that the event of Sandy and what we experienced, the destruction of homes, the flooding of the streets, the destruction of electrical lines, that was a bit of a capsule of what was to come. That our multifamily housing community had just experienced this event, and now we understood that there was a gap around the nation, that there wasn't enough awareness from many housing providers of extreme weather. Believe it or not, unless you were in New Orleans or in Miami or on the front lines of risk in California, like, extreme weather was not something that you thought about a great deal. So that started my journey into the world of extreme weather and risk and housing protection. And we did a lot of good work in those days. And then from those early days, I expanded the program around the country. We set up programs in Florida, California, DC to help multifamily housing deal with risk. But it's been a real journey. And at that time, Heidi, when we were starting out, climate risk was not really considered a thing. Like, it was kind of like a nice to do, kind of nice to have service around, but we didn't have the kind of national conversation we have today.
Like, I remember hiding in the closet with my brother when Sandy was happening. And like, that is definitely one of the more inciting memories that I also have in my kind of journey, I guess, and all this. And yeah, no, the fact is, like, climate resilience now is kind of a more common part of the conversation, but that's so cool, I guess, that you were kind of at the start of.
I remember being the night before Sandy, this night of Sandy, I said, I'm staying in my Harlem apartment. I'm not leaving my city. This is my home. This is my city. I want to be here. And it was a night I'll never forget. You really felt like the world was exploding and like you had no control. And for New Yorkers not to have control is not a good picture. I think that there was a lot of great work that came out of that time. We had great innovation happening at the federal level, down from Rebuild by Design, Far Rockaway design competition that my colleague Bonnie Jung initiated. And we learned so much about what works and what doesn't work. I will tell you this. Going to the Lower East Side and seeing the resilience of the housing owners and the residents was incredible. And when we talk about resilience, I think the term can be very academic. I think basically it's about strength, right? Being strong and being able to be nimble and adaptive. And to me, that characterizes our country. Like, we are a country of adaptive souls. We deal with challenges and we survive and we learn and we grow. So resilience, as academic as it sometimes feels to me, is about the very sort of fabric of our country. But now we have a new challenge that we're confronting, which is a rising risk from extreme weather, fueled by climate, fueled by development, fueled by decisions that we've made around our built environment. And I truly, truly believe that it's a risk that we need to take very seriously. So I work on the consequences of what folks will characterize as climate change. I work on what happens when a community is impacted by a major flood or a major storm, and how do they adapt those issues. That's my particular focus in life.
I guess talking about that, like, how has your background in urban planning and I guess like your educational journey shaped your approach to addressing climate and sustainability challenges?
That's a great question. My planning degree at Hunter in New York, and I'll never forget, I must share this with you, Heidi, because it's a really important moment. The first day of planning school was September 11th, 2001. And I remember waking up in the morning. I was still at Catholic Charities, and I was going part-time at Catholic Charities so I could do full-time at my college. And it was a working person's school. So you could do this. You didn't have to dedicate your entire life. You could work outside of school. And it was a very helpful thing for working class New Yorkers. And so I woke up, got on the subway and ready for school. And around 9:15, I'm on the subway and I start seeing people coming into the subway car covered in dust. I still can't believe it to this day, Heidi. Like covered in dust, falling into the arms of strangers, of strap hangers. And I couldn't believe it. I said, what is going on? I hadn't listened to the radio that morning. I just was ready for school. And I got on the subway and I saw this in the dust and I was like, what is going on? Where is this dust coming from? And we kept going and we went through Union Square and like all around me, there was like a lot of nervous energy and we didn't know what was going on. And I got out of the subway on 68th Street where Hunter was. We got up to the 11th floor where our first class was at it was the 11th floor of the Hunter building in Lexington. And we ascend to the 11th floor and we go into our class. And the first class ever in my planning school was affordable housing policy with Tom and Gotti. We fill up this dark room with no windows and all the students, and we're sitting there listening to Tom talk about the social housing programs in Austria. And I said, hey, wait a minute, there's something going on outside. And I stepped out of the room and I said, I need to see the windows. And the windows overlooked the entire southern Manhattan. And I watched the burning of the World Trade Center from the 16th floor of my urban planning school. And I went back to the class. I said, Tom, we've got to close class. Let's get everyone out of here. And so people finally like ignored the teacher and went out to see this. And we saw the towers fall from the 11th floor of the building on Lexington Avenue. And that was my first day of planning school. And so when you talk about informed by life experience, I mean, my goodness, what a day. We'll never forget that day. And then we all rolled out and then walked across the Queensboro Bridge with the rest of the thousands of New Yorkers leaving and exiting Manhattan. So that was that feels very emblematic of my journey through life and my career, where it's these extreme circumstances that seem to inform what I do. I think that I believe very strongly in what's called practice and theory together. I think that, like I said before, I really pride myself on having been a practitioner, being on the ground when I involved in whether it's policy or investment. I truly believe that you need real lived experience to be able to do the best work you can. And if you don't know how to do it, you know who to ask. So maybe it's the school of hard knocks, but the planning school then led me to go out to California and do some really important work on the ground. I was really happy to be able to bring my lived experience to the work I've done. I am one that learns on the job often. So if I want to learn about construction, I've often found myself running a construction project like I did at the Eco Center at Heron's Head Park in San Francisco.
No, I really like the idea of like practice and theory being, not just separated. It's definitely important to have them.
Let me give you an example of another important point that I'd like to make about this for folks listening that are students or young professionals. When I learned about urban planning, I learned about planning from the community-based planning sort of worldview. For example, I worked with the Booker T. Washington community out in Jersey. It's the second oldest public housing site in the country, built in like 1947. And we were doing some work with Booker T. Washington, Jersey City Housing Authority, to help them deal with their flood issues. And so we brought in some teams of architects to design a way to reduce flooding on a community that was like devastated during Superstorm Sandy. Flooding everywhere. And when you get flooding is a very damaging event. It can be irreparable in terms of the damage it makes. So for me, when we're doing a plan, you have to include the voices that you're planning for, your consumer. And so it was very important for me to work with the residents, bring in the resident voices to the planning team, get a walkthrough with the residents of the site, let the residents tell us where the problems were, and then have the residents at the table as we're designing the program and the project. That is critical. I truly value and believe that the end consumer has to be at the table. Just as I believe that when you're building a construction project, you should always have a builder in the team. I think that it's really critical to blend practice and theory. at all times and always plan for the end user to be part of the decision making and designing.
That just makes total sense entirely. What is one mistake possibly that you've made early in your career that taught you an important lesson, or is just could you share some important lessons that you've learned throughout your career?
So I think that one of the lessons I've learned throughout my career, which I am really thankful to folks that have taught me along the way, and I've not had, there's fits and bursts where sometimes you do work that you feel like you're doing a great job and, what could be the problem? And then you're told by a colleague that you're actually not doing a great job. You have to, I think, check in with your colleagues at all times whenever you're doing something and ask them, how am I doing? Do you understand me? Is this clear? I think the thing that I did not appreciate earlier on is the critical importance of relationships that I appreciate now. So I think that 99.9% of everything you do in life is based on your relationships and who you are able to lean on, get input from, get support from. And it took me a long time to realize the value of relationships in the work we're doing. And it's through leading teams and bringing people together that I've realized not only do I value relationships, but it's probably my strongest suit. It's probably my strongest superpower, which is to bring people together. At some point in my life, I thought I can do everything on my own, right? Like typical single mother outlook. I've got it. I can cook, I can clean, I can balance the budget. I don't need any help. And for many years in my career, that was my mentality. Like if I ask for help, I am not performing. Or if I ask for help, I'm disappointing someone. Like I should be able to do it by myself. But you know what, Heidi? You can't. And people want to be included and people want to have jobs. They want to feel that they're doing something important. And I think that when you don't give people responsibility and help to empower them by giving them, a job, for example, on a team, and you take that on yourself, you're actually disempowering people. I think I've learned to appreciate that work brings us together, that when you work with people and you work on teams, you develop incredible relationships. So like at the White House, I have to tell you, I have some of the most amazing relationships that I will keep for my life. Being huddled together, doing policy, laughing, crying, whatever it looks like, those relationships will carry us forward. That is something that I wish I knew earlier, that I can mobilize a team. I can give out assignments. People will do it and they'll be stronger for it. I don't have to do everything on my own. And if I don't know something, I need to ask someone to explain it to me, because I will spend way more time making mistakes and not doing it the right way if I don't.
And I guess in relation to that, what challenges have you faced working in, I guess including the nonprofit sector, and how did you overcome them?
So the biggest challenge I've faced across my professional life is, where is the capital to do this work? How do we find the money to get the work done? I mean, I can tell you when I was building the Eco Center, or it's called the Living Classroom essentially, but we had to call it the Eco Center for permitting reasons. We were building this building, and all of a sudden in 2008, the state ran out of money because of the housing crisis in DC and what that led to, which was massive upheaval of the housing system. Well, the states that were most impacted, meaning California, lost liquidity. And so I was building a center, I had everything ready, and I lost the ability to charge the state for the work we were doing. And so that got me started on a path of, how do you raise capital for important projects? And so thankfully, because of President Obama's ARA program, we were able to raise the money to finish the project. But throughout my life, I've realized and seen that really exciting projects that seem wonderful, unless you have the capital to make them come to life, it really becomes just a nice idea. And so through my life, I have become more and more attracted to ideas and work that'll help me raise money and finance work. So in 2018 or so, I decided that I really wanted to work in the capital space, the finance space, because I wanted to learn how to actually raise the money I needed for the programs I wanted to do. And so I've been on this sort of theme for many years now. I did go to the White House for 2 years where I was able to work with a lot of different public funding and understand how to build public funding streams for good. And I am very excited about the opportunities to work in the private sector to bring together more support for the communities that we need to build for housing that's strong, adaptive to extreme weather, communities that are able to withstand very strong events, working deeply in areas where there's a lot of risk for asset holders to try to reduce their exposure to this risk, material risk, so that, the housing is safe, people are able to maintain their investments, and that our communities and our nation is strong. So to me, that's sort of my trajectory right now. And when I got out of college, I never thought I would say this. I write to Catholic Charities, but now I'm really eager to find ways of blending capital so that we can create the kind of support we need. And I think that, I think a lot of folks are interested in this space right now.
Yeah, no, and I guess this kind of leads into my next question. Your work on the climate resilient housing series, it led to $250 million in housing resilience investments. What strategies or frameworks were key to achieving this milestone? And at the federal level, what are the barriers to housing development?
So I had mentioned we had worked very deeply in Florida and California and up and down that West Coast, as a matter of fact, in DC, to set up programs that would help developers and housing owners and cities and states identify the best ways to utilize money for the purpose of safeguarding housing. And so a lot of the work I'm really proud of is helping to help cities and states take funding that they've been able to raise and shape programs that will help the housing and assets be stronger, be more insurable, be more resilient. And so a lot of the work I've done, I've put forward with Enterprise 2 books on housing resilience. One was the Multifamily Housing Resilience Guidebook, which is now a website called Keep Safe Housing. That was a result of a lot of our Sandy work. And then the next book was called Keep Safe Puerto Rico, which was a result of the work I did in Puerto Rico with colleagues at Enterprise and across Puerto Rico to help identify how to shape housing so that's resilient to extreme heat, flooding, wind, and help to program some of the CDBGDR funding that was coming into the island after Maria. And so a lot of the funding coming into the island is going directly to housing design and housing construction. So what we were trying to do is make sure that there were strategies and solutions that the state could draw upon to determine the path of those housing. And it also was used in VI. And so now we have, across the country, housing that's elevated, housing that is got wet floodproofing in place, housing that is built to a standard that is flood resilient. We've got housing that is built with stronger roofs, sites that have been treated so that they are able to be flood resilient. And so a lot of the funding that came forward as a result of those projects or informed by those projects is a lot of public funding. We've got HUD, CDBGR funds, we've got regular CDBG funds, we've got investments from banks, investments from cities that have issued bonds for their housing supply, and they've included resilience in there. Utilities that have sponsored housing programs or rebates for housing programs. So it runs the gamut. What funding has been developed and created and is shaped by a lot of this work that I have led with colleagues, with partners. We actually, after the Keep Safe Puerto Rico book, we named our state programs Keep Safe. So we have Keep Safe Florida, Keep Safe Miami, Keep Safe Fort Lauderdale. We had Keep Safe California. And so I'm proud of this work. I think that, ultimately and fundamentally, I think we need to continue to keep a watchful eye on how we're funding this work. What funds are available to do this kind of work? And when we're building in communities that have high wind risk or high flood risk, that we're attending to that because we want this housing to last at least 30 years. right? The lifetime of a mortgage.
We're getting into kind of like the technicalities, and I wanted to explore that more and I guess like make it somewhat accessible to listeners. You helped pass the nation's first utility-sponsored environmental justice policy in San Francisco. Can you talk more about like what that process was like and what utility-sponsored means?
Thank you for raising that. So when I was back in California, and I lived in a community called Bayview Hunters Point, and it's a community that is on the southern part of the city. It is on the shoreline of the bay. It is located between two major highways. It's the site of the largest wastewater treatment facility in San Francisco. It's huge. It's like 60 acres of wastewater treatment in the middle of the community. It also has what we have called two peaker plants when I moved there. And peaker plants are basically plants, power plants that operate on petroleum, or it used to be coal, that come on when the power surge happens. So when you need more power, the peaker plants come into play. But peaker plants are dirty. They create a lot of air problems. And on top of all this, we lived right next to the Superfund site, which is the base, the naval base that was used in World War II to clean up the ships that delivered atomic materials to Japan. So on top of all this, you've got the Superfund site. You've got the wastewater treatment plant. Every day I would wake up in the morning and smell the wastewater treatment because not to get into it, but there's parts of the process that are not very nice to smell. It's also a community that is, well, at the time, it was majority Black and brown, low income, and a lot of immigrant households. So I was there living, and I became very active in my local community politics because I was kind of really upset about the smells and the toxin. And I was asked by the supervisor in San Francisco to represent the community to the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission Citizens Advisory Board, which in San Francisco, they have sunshine laws, which means citizens are engaged in the policymaking of certain agencies. And while I was at the Citizens Advisory Committee, I set up a sub-advisory on environmental justice. One of the singular things I wanted to do was to understand how do we abate decisions that would put communities at harm, particularly communities like Bayview Hunters Point. How do we abate situations where we have wastewater treatment plants getting built in the middle of a residential community?
Could you also define for listeners what abate means?
Oh, abate, basically prevent. So, imagine this. You have a huge wastewater treatment facility where, simply put, raw sewage comes in from the city. It gets treated in this facility, and then comes out of the community through what's called outfalls. The community is both lending its air and its space to treat the sewage, and then at the same time, the sewage is coming out of the waterways of the community. So it's a really big impact. And so one of the things I wanted to see is when capital projects are created, the communities have an opportunity to engage in a much more strategic way as an environmental justice lens. When this was passed, I think it was 2008, this was not a conversation that the nation was having. Like, environmental justice was very much a conversation we were having in California, in pockets of communities, in New York, in Florida, in pockets of communities that were impacted by, a variety of issues. But I was really proud that through a lot of negotiation and engagement with community leaders and leaders across the city of San Francisco, that we could come to negotiate a policy that really helped to ultimately build the SFPUC, Environmental Justice Unit, which has influenced a lot of utilities around the country, including New York, in their efforts to make sure that they're responsive to community needs. So I was really proud of that work. I'll never forget the day we got it passed. And it felt like we really did something really powerful. And now we can turn to that policy whenever capital projects are done. Look, I believe strongly in the workings of a city. We must have wastewater treatment. We must have electrical energy. We've got to have potable water delivered, but we can do better. We can make sure that these systems are safe, that we're not impacting our air quality, our water quality, that we're doing it safely, affordably. And I think that was just a really great exercise in coming together and negotiating a really good deal.
Like, in going also into other initiatives that you've been a part of, what are some, like, things from your time at the White House that you felt have been memorable?
One of my favorite times at the White House was the development of the climate resilience framework that was done with so many amazing colleagues around the country. We really feel that while we're attending to the causes of climate change, which is the emissions reduction and the mitigation piece, all of that is necessary to bring down our global warming. But the consequences of climate change are upon us. We're feeling them every day now. And so for me, and for many of my colleagues that worked on this incredible document, we needed to put out a roadmap for how we deal with the consequences of a changing climate. And so this was a really amazing effort. We had an incredible interagency network of 100 plus colleagues across the federal government providing guidance, providing insight into what it would look like to have a roadmap for climate resilience. We created a whole set of principles for what climate resilience policy should look like, and then a whole bunch of actions that we felt were important to advance this work. And so now, thanks to this framework, we have something we can use to help inform our policies, our programs, our capital going forward. I was really proud of that. We had the Climate Policy Office and National Security Council and Council for Environmental Quality, which I was at the time, brought together an incredible group of folks to have a conversation around, okay, we have the framework, now what? That led us to having discussions with funders on the kind of money that could be put forward to this work. We had conversations around how the insurance industry can step up, how the construction industry can step up. And so to this day, I was really proud of that. And, I think that in my housing space, one of the areas I'm proud of is the work we did to ensure that the Violence Against Women Act was clear for folks that were living in apartments that are federally financed. I think the passage of the federal flood risk management standard that was passed and a rule was put into place by HUD and then FEMA was a really proud moment, because when we're building in an area that has a floodplain or is in a riverine floodplain, certain standards need to be incorporated into the building. It's practical, common sense stuff, but I think that it's going to be helpful for communities, especially when we think about like what's happening with the insurance space, why we want to reduce risk at the front end. And the FFRMS basically says you have to build housing that can deal with managing flood risk. So there's been so many moments. I think, to be honest, Heidi, just the ability to do this work at the highest level has been an honor of my lifetime. And here's the thing. To me, this work is not partisan. This is about common sense strategies to help our communities survive extreme weather conditions. I am not here to talk about why those conditions are happening. What I am here to do is to say we've got to figure out how to adapt to these storm events, these fires, these floods, and make sure we safeguard our communities. That's my service right now.
It is definitely not a partisan service, and it's not a partisan issue at all. Unfortunately, it's been treated like one, and especially in the wake of this new administration, the Trump administration being elected. That's kind of all been up in the air and in question, especially recently. I guess with that in mind and your experience at the White House with that upcoming change, how do you foresee that affecting climate resilience efforts moving forward?
Well, I'm optimistic that we are going to be able to do a lot of good work in the coming years. It is important to note that we had a lot of good work done over the last couple of years on risk reduction. First Trump administration, we were able to get some really important programs passed, such as the Building Resilient Inclusive Communities through FEMA. We had some good work done at different agencies on risk reduction. I think that risk reduction is an issue that we all can get around, that we need to remove the kind of risks that we're facing, stabilize our nation's assets, whether it's a naval base in Newport News or a home and a housing facility in the middle of the Mendocino forest. We all have the burden of paying insurance bills. We all have the burden of making sure our homes are safe, that our businesses have continuity of operations, that communities have a tax base and a continued tax base that they can count on. And to do that, you need housing and businesses that are operating. I think that for me, focusing on risk reduction related to extreme weather is a track that we can all get around. And I've talked to many of my incoming colleagues that agree. And whether, I think that when we talk with the National Home Builders Association, they have a great set of standards that they've put forward to help make sure housing is safe. We've got groups like IBHS that are doing great work on making sure they've got fortified standards for housing. I don't see this as a partisan issue. I think the question for me is, how are we going to pay for it? Who pays for it? But I think that we can all agree that the American spirit is about being strong, being resilient, being sufficient, being able to solve problems that seem to be intractable. I'm looking forward to having more access to technologies to help us solve some of these issues, help us assess risk, help us figure out the solution. So I'm very optimistic going forward for this particular space.
That's great to hear, and it gives me hope as well. I guess, kind of a little bit towards what you just mentioned there, what are some innovative technologies or strategies that you see as game changers for creating climate adaptive and affordable communities in the next decade or so?
So one of the things I always say is, if you're putting in new solar panels in your home, you're going to want to make sure the roof is able to withstand a wind event. And I love some systems out there that I think are really important. So there's a standard called the Fortified Standard, which is a standard that the Insurance Business Institute has created to help make sure that roofs are able to be resilient to high wind events. I think that those kind of innovations, which are developed in concert with the insurance community, are really important for us to consider as we include, as a lot of homes are now rehabilitating to accommodate for heat pumps and electrification. I think it's important to also have this complementary climate adaptation scope along with it. I see a lot of innovation in modular housing and what modular housing can provide us with, which is a certain level of certainty when building housing. And I think that, you can have a hybrid modular stick assembly, but I think that there's a lot of really great innovation that's happening in the modular space and helping to rapidly increase our housing supply. So that's one of the critical issues we're facing right now, is we need to bolster our housing supply. We need to bolster our housing supply so that it's climate resilient. So I think there's a lot of good work we can do with working on mechanization and factory-based systems. I think that there's a lot of good work happening on materials, flood-resistant materials that are able to be absorptive of heat. I would love to see a world in which there's competitions on the kind of materials that we would use in flood-prone areas so that a community or a house can bring those materials forward and be able to safeguard their property. I will say this, having worked deeply in Latin America and Puerto Rico, I saw a lot of really great vernacular building tradition that I think are really wonderful to bring and consider in our built environment. So in Puerto Rico, most floors are tiled in areas that are floodable. And so I think that there's a lot we can learn from vernacular building practices, buildings that were designed and adapted to local conditions across our country. I think I'm a big fan of bringing back the vernacular in the way we think it's best in this current century.
Yeah, me too. On that front. And I guess now kind of moving towards advice for listeners, what advice would you give to emerging professionals that are, passionate, be it about urban planning or climate finance or social equity in their careers?
I will say this, your relationships are everything. Make sure you invest in your relationships. Make sure you respect everyone that you work with and try to, even if you don't find common ground, I think that relationships are everything. I would say take risks when you're younger, get involved in the projects that may not pay you a lot of money, but as long as you can survive, take the chance, take your risks early on. It's harder and harder once you have kids or once you get settled to do that. A lot of the risks I took early on have totally transformed the way I look at the world. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. We all make mistakes. We get fired, we get hired, we get fired. Some of the worst situations, or what feels like the worst situation, might also be one of your greatest lessons. And so I would say those are my 3 tips.
Thank you for that. And this is more of like a personal question. If you could turn back time, butterfly effects aside, and tell your younger self something that you've learned from life so far, what would you say to them?
I would say that I would tell my younger self not to be so hard on myself. Don't take it so personally and take care of yourself more. The projects, we think, oh my God, if this doesn't happen or this doesn't happen on my timeline, the world is over, and you spend so much personal investment in these decisions that sometimes they're just out of your control. And so I think that I would meditate more and I would tell myself to just don't take it so personally. It's not always you.
That's great advice. Yeah, I mean, thank you so much again for taking the time to be here and for
Thank
this.
you, Heidi.
I've learned so much. And for listeners who want to, keep up with the work that you do, where can they find you?
LinkedIn. I do a lot of LinkedIn posts. That's the best way to find me.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Heidi.
Thank you.